At about 7 in the morning on the 30th of June, 1908, something detonated in the sky above the Podkamenia Tunguska River in central Siberia. It released roughly 1,000 times the energy of the Hiroshima bomb. It flattened around 80 million trees across 2,000 square kilometers. And when the first scientific expedition finally reached the site, 19 years later, it found no crater. Nothing had landed. The forest had been destroyed by something that never touched the ground. 65 kilometers away, at the trading post of Vanavara, a man named Semenov was sitting outside his house. He described the northern sky splitting open with fire. The heat was strong enough that he thought his shirt was burning, and he tried to tear it off. Then the blast wave arrived and threw him from his chair. He said the ground shook and a sound came like artillery, going on, and hot wind rolled past carrying the smell of scorched earth. The shock wave was recorded by seismographs across Eurasia. Barometers as far away as Britain registered a pressure wave that circled the entire planet twice. For several nights afterwards, the skies over Europe glowed so brightly that people in London reported reading newspapers outdoors at midnight, and golfers in Scotland played past 11 at night without lamps. Nobody in Europe knew what they were looking at. The event that caused it had happened in one of the emptiest places on Earth. That emptiness is the reason the story survives as a mystery rather than a catastrophe. There was no city underneath. The Evenki reindeer herders who lived in the region lost herds and shelters, and accounts describe injuries, but a comparable airburst over a populated capital would have been one of the deadliest events in human history. Instead, it happened above a forest, and the world took 19 years to send anyone to look. Russia in 1908 was not a country with the appetite for a Siberian expedition over a distant bang. Then came the World War, a revolution, and a civil war. The region was roughly a week of hard travel from the nearest railway, through swamp and forest with no roads. Reports from the Evenki reached local officials and newspapers, and were filed as curiosities. The scientific world simply had no mechanism for caring about an explosion nobody had died visibly under. The man who eventually cared was Leonid Kulik, a mineralogist at the Russian Academy of Sciences. Kulik was hunting meteorites. He had read the old newspaper accounts and reached the obvious conclusion: a large iron meteorite had struck Siberia, and somewhere out there was an enormous mass of extraterrestrial metal waiting to be claimed for his institute. That expectation shaped everything he did, and it is the reason the site confused him so badly. Kulik reached the region in 1927. What he found did not look like an impact. It looked like something had pressed down on the forest from directly above. Trees lay flattened in a vast radial pattern, trunks pointing outward away from a center, kilometer after kilometer. He followed the direction of the fallen trunks inward, the way you would follow arrows, expecting to arrive at a hole in the ground. At the center he found the strangest thing in the whole story. The trees there were still standing. Stripped completely bare of branches and bark, burned, dead, upright, like a field of telegraph poles. That is the signature of a blast arriving from straight overhead rather than from an angle. At the epicenter the pressure came down the trunk's own axis and had nothing to push over. Around that patch of standing dead wood, there was no crater at all. Kulik refused to accept it. He returned across several expeditions, convinced the crater must be hidden. He identified boggy depressions in the ground and had them drained and dug, at real cost and physical risk, looking for buried meteoric iron. The pits produced tree stumps and peat. He drilled. He surveyed. Over roughly a decade of work he never recovered the mass of metal he had come for, because it had never existed. The absence of a crater is not actually mysterious once you drop the assumption of a landing. A rocky body entering the atmosphere at tens of kilometers per second is not a bullet meeting armor. It is a fragile object slamming into a wall of air that it cannot push aside fast enough. The pressure on its leading face becomes greater than the strength of the rock holding it together, and it disintegrates while still kilometers up. The energy goes into the air. That is, estimates of the yield vary widely depending on method, from single-digit megatons to the low tens. The commonly cited figure is around 12. The uncertainty is honest, not evasive. You are reconstructing a bomb from bent trees a century later. The evidence for something extraterrestrial is there, just not in the form Kulik wanted. Researchers have recovered microscopic material from the site consistent with a cosmic origin, including tiny carbon structures and metallic spherules in the peat layers dating to 1908. There is no boulder to put in a museum. There is a thin dusting of a body that turned itself into pressure and light before it could arrive. Roughly 8 kilometers north-northwest of the epicenter sits Lake Checo, a small body of water with an unusual funnel shape. In 2007 an Italian research team argued it was a crater after all, gouged by a surviving fragment that made it to the ground. The claim was attractive because it would close the loop, an airburst plus one piece that landed. It also implied there was something down there to find. The counterargument is mostly about mud. If Lake Checo were blasted open in 1908, its floor should be a raw, disturbed pit. Sediment cores taken by other teams indicate a layered bottom that appears to have accumulated over a much longer period, with material older than the event. Critics also note that trees around the lake were not flattened in the pattern you would expect from a fragment arriving there. Most researchers do not accept it as an impact crater. This is where the honest version of the story diverges from the exciting one. Tunguska is not unexplained. The mechanism is understood, and it has been observed since. In 2013 a much smaller body exploded over Chelyabinsk, injuring roughly 1,500 people mostly through shattered window glass, and it left no crater either. What remains genuinely open at Tunguska is the detail. The exact size, the exact composition, whether it was a stony asteroid or something icier. That distinction matters because the gaps get filled with nonsense. Over the last century Tunguska has been attributed to antimatter, a microscopic black hole, an alien craft exploding, and a death ray fired by Nikola Tesla. Each of those requires discarding the ordinary explanation that already fits the flattened trees, the pressure wave, the glowing skies, and the cosmic dust in the peat. The best testimony about Tunguska came from people the scientific expeditions were not especially interested in. The Evenki are reindeer herders, and in 1908 they were living directly under the blast. Their accounts were collected decades later, filtered through interpreters and through the memory of children who had grown old. They are not clean data. They are also the only description anyone has of standing beneath the thing. The recurring details are consistent in a way that is hard to fake. A second sun appearing in the north. Heat that made people believe their clothing was alight. A sound that arrived after the light, in a long rolling series rather than a single crack. Tents lifted into the air along with the people inside them. Reindeer herds scattered and killed. Storehouses of dried fish and equipment destroyed. There is a cultural layer over the accounts that Soviet researchers often stripped out and that is worth restoring. Several Evenki families interpreted the event as the god Ogdi descending in anger, and treated the flattened zone afterwards as cursed ground to be avoided. That is not superstition getting in the way of the facts. It is a reasonable response to watching the sky detonate, and it is part of why the site sat undisturbed for 2 decades. It also produced the one detail that undercuts the tidy version of the story. Some accounts describe not one but a sequence of events, lights and noises spread over a period, which does not sit comfortably with a single clean airburst. Researchers disagree about whether that reflects fragmentation of the body into several pieces, echoing across the terrain, or simply the compression of separate memories over 40 years of retelling. The frightening fact about Tunguska is not that it is unexplained. It is that it is routine. Objects in that size range are not rare visitors from the edge of the solar system. They cross Earth's orbit regularly, they are small enough to be nearly invisible until they are close, and there is no version of the physics that requires them to arrive over empty forest. Earth rotates roughly 15 degrees an hour. Shift the arrival time of the 1908 object by a matter of hours and the same explosion occurs over a populated part of Europe or Asia instead of the Siberian taiga. Nothing about the object would need to change. Nothing about its trajectory would need to change. Only the clock. That is why the event stopped being a curiosity and became a budget line. Tunguska is the standard reference case in planetary defense work, the concrete answer to the question of what a city-scale airburst actually does to the ground beneath it. Modern survey telescopes exist substantially to find these objects while they are still years away rather than seconds. Kulik spent a decade digging for a rock that was never there. He was looking for the wrong thing, and in the process he documented the right one, the radial trees, the standing dead poles at the center, the shape of a blast that came from the sky and stayed in the sky. He died in 1942, a prisoner of war, and never saw his mystery resolved. The forest he mapped has largely grown back. The next one is a scheduling problem, not a question of whether.